So, in preparation for this recording and this podcast, I went to Tony Leon's social media, and I saw there that he had posted a very nice photo of him and John Steenhuisen. They were chatting, I think, at a bar or something like that, but it was very, very clearly around the current negotiations and current discussions. And I went, as I do, into the comments, and I see some of them were interesting. Sean says, voted in by the blacks you despise. Bob says, I thought you were dead, sorry. And somebody whose name I can't read says, South Africa is white again. Tony Leon, good morning. Are you sensitive?
No, I'm not particularly sensitive. I also think if you go into that toxic stew called social media, which probably for my sins of omission and commission, I participate in from time to time, then you've got to, take the lumps, as Boris Johnson would have said, or did once say. So, yeah, look, people say a lot of things, and that's incidentally not a photograph from a bar. That's might be the Last Chance Saloon. That was in detailed discussion, John Steenhuisen last Friday over the at the meeting of Parliament, when the DA was in negotiations with the ANC about the statement of intent. And there were some last-minute proposed changes from the other side that we were conferring about. So that's the context of the photo.
So just for clarity, I'm Howard Feldman. This is a podcast. Imagine if I was sensitive. This is when I chat to people I think have stood up when others have sat down, people who haven't minded what necessarily has come their way because they've stood by their convictions and what they believe is right. We're recording this on June the 26th. And the reason that I say that so specifically is because to date, there isn't an announcement of an agreement. I obviously have to be because I'm going to say I'm going to be sensitive, but I'm not. But I'll ask questions. If Tony Leon can't answer them, then he will just simply say that he's unable to because he is in the throngs of these negotiations. It's actually an incredible thing because in some ways, I would imagine, as difficult as this has been, it's also really given you the opportunity to shape South Africa's future in a way that very few people have had in terms of opportunity.
Yeah, I guess so. I'm doing this current round of negotiations because John Steenhuisen asked me to join his team, and I was happy to do that because there's obviously a lot at stake for the country, for the people, and for the party. In that order, I would say. It's, if you were to use that American expression, it's my third rodeo. In the 1990s, when I was much younger, in my 30s, I was a delegate to the CODESA constitutional negotiations and then to the multi-party negotiation process, which birthed the constitution, and then thereafter in Parliament as a leader of the DP for the 1996 finalization of the constitution. So, in those negotiations, first of all, I was much younger. So I had less experience, and therefore I knew all the answers. Now I know a lot more questions.
And maybe more optimistic. I don't know.
More optimistic in 93 than in 2024, probably. And then, obviously, when I was the leader of the Democratic Party, we had a very significant round of negotiations with the then new National Party to create the Democratic Alliance, which yesterday celebrated its 24th birthday. So it's one of the few institutions to have both withstood the rigors of political South Africa and actually increased its footprint. But, in the first two negotiations, the 93-96 constitution and the birth of the DA, it was a lot easier because, first of all, there seemed to be all to play for then. And now we are, you might say, leavened or weathered by the experiences that we've gone through, Howard. And, we don't have that much of a safety margin now to either get it right or not get it at all. So I think there is a weightier sense of responsibility now, even though I'm only, one of 6 DA negotiators. I'm no longer the leader, which is also quite an interesting dynamic because I had been the leader. Helen Ziller was my successor.
Is that difficult for you? Is that difficult to have been in that position no longer holding that authority power position, but in fact still very much central to the direction of the party now.
Well, I describe myself as the poor man's David Cameron. He, as you know, was the leader of the Conservative Party and the Prime Minister, post I never reached, and then was brought back by Rishi Sunak as the Foreign Secretary in the last few months. So even though he'd obviously once led the party and the government, he's now just a member of. So yeah, I don't have any, I've got no status anxiety, Howard. That is one of the, if it's an advantage, one of the pluses. You know, I don't feel the need to be acknowledged or to be deferred to. I remember when I became an ambassador many years ago, one of the old lags at Durko said to me, he said, "Those who mind don't matter, those who matter don't mind." I've always thought that's a very good description. So I'm very much signed up a member of that particular club.
Yeah, and we should all put that on our social media feed, shouldn't we? So just let's just try and understand. I mean, you were a lawyer, you are a lawyer. In fact, when I was
tribalized attorney, I call myself.
Oh, is that what it is? When in fact I was doing my LLB, you were lecturing. I think, went to one of. Were you lecturing constitutional law?
I was indeed. Yeah, between 1983 and 1986. Right. No, sorry, 1986 and 1989. No. Yeah, sorry.
Okay, so no, then I definitely missed you. I was there in 91, but you definitely you had given, maybe it was a guest lecture, but you were you were obviously a lawyer. You then left to become much more involved with politics. Was this part of your upbringing? Who was Tony Leon as a child? Were you always going to be moving in this direction?
Well, look, I grew up in in what was in Durban in the 1960s and 70s, you might call a liberal white family. My father was a lawyer who became a judge. My mother was very active in politics, in a range of, I suppose, broadly you would call it civil society movements of the time. Mm-hmm. And, you know, although Durban was extremely conservative, as in the white community anyway, we were not part of the kind of conservative Durban consensus. We were a little more liberal, but we also were part of the kind of the secular Jewish community. Mm-hmm. So I didn't go to Jewish schools, but we very much, did all the rituals from, brisses to bar mitzvahs and some occasional synagogue attendance. So there were an amalgam of influences on me, of whom obviously I think, as in all cases, the parental influence was significant. But I went to some interesting schools, one of which was pretty conservative and quite very disciplinarian. But you did have an opportunity, even if you weren't part of the sort of rugger-bugger community, to flourish. And I was allowed to indulge in my various interests, whether they were politics and debating and other matters. And you are the amalgam of all those influences. But I've never really changed my basic philosophy, which you could call liberal democratic. I believe that people's identity is shaped by many things, but at the end of the day, you're an individual, and the individual is the touchstone of value in any society. And actually, in terms of Judeo-Christian religious underpinnings of what you might call the Western way of the world, and many non-Western instances as well, I don't believe that your demography determines your destiny. So, for example, although I'm occasionally, quite frequently these days, reminded the fact that I'm a Jew, especially since 7th of October, I never made a capital issue out of my religion. And in fact,
I'm sorry, I'm interrupting you, but that is so interesting because in my mind, Tony Leon was always the politician, as you say, liberal Democrat, I knew you were Jewish, but it didn't feature as a corner. I mean, obviously, in your world, it might be that it's a cornerstone of who you are, but it certainly wasn't the public perception. And since October the 7th, that seems to have bubbled to the surface.
Look, I think a lot of South Africa is captured by identity politics, especially race, which is a huge factor of people, and a lot of it is not just because it is obviously our history, but there are a lot of ethnic entrepreneurs in our politics who actually trade in this in order to advantage their political parties or movements. And the DA, warts and all, and it's got many faults, but it's my team, is the one that sort of has probably got the highest cross-racial percentages in terms of support. If you look at the recent distillation by Gareth van Onselen, Davie Scholz, and others on the racial voting patterns in South Africa, the DA draws its support from all racial communities, not one. In fact, if the DA was a white party, then it would be about a 7% party, not a 22% party, given the decline of whites as a proportion of the total population of South Africa. And it clearly is not just confined to that corner. So, yeah, I think that's, I've always sort of believed that you can make an offer and you can have a value system that's not dependent on your racial or your religious background. But obviously, since events in Israel on the 7th of October, there's now been a huge emphasis on people's religious identity, whether you choose to have it or not. And those are one of the modern facts of life in the year 2024.
Yeah, it's interesting. I found, to some extent, I've always been a little bit more outwardly Jewish and Zionistic, but in fact, my weekly articles for News 24, and I try to avoid writing about Israel until October the 7th. And all of a sudden, now I'm that Israel guy. But it just has called for a different approach, because there is this overwhelming and very, very ugly misrepresentation of those facts. I don't necessarily want to go too much into that, because it is just something that unfortunately we live with. You clearly have chosen to speak out on it as well, where necessary. But the current role and what you're really involved with now is trying to set South Africa, or reset South Africa. And you're something you were saying before about we don't exactly have a large margin of error that is allowable right now. We do seem to spend an enormous amount of time, or inordinate amount of time, on the precipice in South Africa, don't we?
Yes, 5 minutes to midnight and all those cliches.
Yeah.
And look, and a lot of it is kind of false deadline setting. I mean, someone sent me a note yesterday, which I must just try and find, where he basically said, he just sent me the length of time it took for coalition governments. And believe me, what we're talking about in South Africa now, whatever we choose to call it, is a coalition government. The months it took. I think in Belgium, which is always a contested polity of multi-party governments with big linguistic and ethnic differences there, incidentally, it took over a year. The Netherlands, 5 or 6 months. I don't know what Israel's record is.
Israel, they never get it right, and they also are 5 minutes away from the solution of the coalition government every day. So
absolutely. So we had about 2 weeks to elect a president. We had literally 2 weeks. We had to have some agreement of whether the DA would support the re-election of Ramaphosa, which we did, but that was subject to an agreement, which is now subject to vigorous interpretation. I had a magnificent legal mentor when I was a lawyer. Well, I had several of them. I was the law firm still headed by Michael Katz, I might say, extraordinary man of great energies still to this day. But one of them, who sadly deceased, really had a huge influence on my life and my very brief and undistinguished legal career, is a man called Philip Penchars. And we had a very difficult, obdurate client. And, we had a written agreement on something. And Mr. Penchars turned around to me and said, that client of ours, he just thinks the signed agreement is a basis for further negotiation. So, some of the current delays are that we have a signed agreement, but it is the basis for further and future negotiations, as the time of this recording not quite concluded yet.
Right, exactly. So I mean, obviously we aren't there yet. I mentioned the date; it's June the 26th. Hopefully, we will be. Are you confident? Are you reasonably confident that the DA is going to reach an agreement that is a decent one?
Well, I think the DA's proposals that have been communicated between the head of the DA and the President of South Africa are decent and fair and considered and not unreasonable. I don't know what the final outcome is at the time of this recording. So,
Right.
it's too early to tell. I hope so, because look, just let's leave aside the arguments and let's look at the pure arithmetic of this, Howard.
Mm.
The ANC is a 40% party. It's not a 70% party.
Right.
The DA is a 22% party, not a 2% party. Those are inarguable arithmetical facts, not chosen by me or Jacob Zuma School of Mathematics, from the electorate. That's what the electoral scoreboard tells us. So if the 40% party and the 22% party can, on reasonable, not on any terms, and the reasonableness of those terms is currently now reaching its final stages of determination, if they can reach an agreement, you have a stable government, at least until there's a major disagreement, but one must not bank on every contingency bar success. And you will have stability not just nationally, you'll have it in Gauteng, you'll have it in KwaZulu-Natal as well, both of which have no majority governments at the moment. And you will also have it, arguably, although it's a bit further down the line, in the metros. I mean, you speak to me from Joburg. I love Joburg. I lived there most of my life. It's a fantastic city, but it's a very dilapidated city because of serious misgovernance.
I refuse to learn the name of our mayor. I believe we have one.
I don't think he'll be there for that much longer, so don't bother. But the reality is that if you can get stability at all three levels of government, then you can go on and do the important work of the people in restoring economic growth, getting jobs and opportunities out there, starting to curb crime because you have stable government. If you don't have an agreement, and this is not a matter of debate, it's a matter of fact, between the biggest and the second biggest party, then the ANC will continue effectively either as a minority government, limping from vote to vote, or with the EFF in government, which at least will give it stability, but it'll be the stability of the economic and social graveyard, in my opinion, then those are the stark alternatives. So, there are a lot of people, I might say in the last 3 weeks, I've heard from friends I know well and friends I didn't know I had, importuning me, you've got to do a deal on any terms. What's happening? Can we, crack open the champagne yet? All this anxiety because people obviously watch
the anxiety. It's very real. The anxiety is real. I don't know that as I was saying, many other countries experience this level of very real danger. An MK, EFF, ANC coalition, it really is what nightmares are made of. When we look at who was signed in yesterday, and some of that colorful cast of characters, it really was. I mean, if it wasn't tragic, it really would be funny. It's a great movie.
Oh, I completely agree. Look, the fact that a disgraced impeached judge like John Schlorpe could be the leader of the opposition South Africa post I once held, but I don't know that I ever was. Well, I was never impeached, and I certainly believe in the Constitution that I swore allegiance to. He has been impeached, and he doesn't believe in the Constitution by his own admission. Is a very frightening prospect. It actually means that the forces in the center have an urgent need to combine. But on the other hand, the combination has got to be on terms that will endure, not on terms that are going to fall apart. Because the worst thing that can happen, it's arguably even worse than the doomsday scenarios I sketched just now, would be to create this government on the flimsiest, most makeshift of foundations and then find it falls apart in 3 months' time. So,
which is what happened in Johannesburg with Action SA. With
exactly
that's exactly what did happen here. And as you speak about the decay, Johannesburg is falling apart, and that is very, very much the reason that that happened. The president's inauguration. I don't know if you were up here. If
No, I was not. I don't have to attend those things anymore, so I generally don't go to things I don't have to go to.
But what was interesting?
I saw some reference to it.
Yeah. So what was interesting, obviously, was the ANC had stripped themselves of their Palestinian paraphernalia. They were once again looked like they were representing South Africans. The president's speech in of itself was fascinating to me because it didn't make reference to all of these other clickbait items and did. If what he was saying was authentic and legitimate, and let's give him the benefit of the doubt for that right now, it certainly seemed as though he had internalized the results of the election and the fact that the only way forward for South Africa was in this manner. What's your thoughts on that?
No, I completely agree. Look, I have to say that since the election results were known, Cyril Ramaphosa has, in his public words and deeds so far, I think evinced considerable statesmanship. And I mean, not least, and it's easy to lose sight of this one. Also, perhaps shouldn't celebrate basic democratic norms, but why not? Is that the ANC, this mighty party of liberation, which sees itself as the soul or vanguard of the people, actually accepted an election result which toppled them from majority power, and they didn't contest the elections. They didn't call out the army. They didn't try and reinterpret the results. And we live in a pretty rough neighborhood. I remember once I was in Israel, and Shimon Peres said, in a rather memorable way, he had of speaking, he said, if it was left to me, I would rather have the Norwegians as our neighbors, but we have the Syrians as our neighbors. So South Africa is not a country, in the middle of Western Europe. We're on the southern tip of Africa with very fragile, failed democracies around us, actually. But there are very few, arguably, other than Botswana, which really have been enduring reasonably long-lived democracies. And we obviously much bigger than most other countries in terms of economic heft in this continent. And yet we had a peaceful transition to, I don't know what, incidentally, as we speak now, but certainly from the majority party having been reduced to the largest minority party, and the ANC and the president playing by the rules of the game. Of course, there's a robust interpretation of what those rules are, which is one of the reasons there's some delays in the announcement of the government. But it hasn't tried to, drive a coach and horses through the constitutional arrangements. And I think to the extent, and I think that was reflected in Ramaphosa's inaugural speech, I think that's to his credit.
Yeah, I happen to think so too. I just want to ask you about, and you have referred to this in terms of the identity politics. You referred to it in terms of the DA's very broad reach. The accusations, the constant accusations of racism within the DA. Of course, there's the nonsensical side about returning to apartheid from there all the way through to some incidents that have happened. And I know that you don't represent the party. I am very aware of that as we speak. But somehow this label endures. Now, I don't know if it endures just on social media and media, because I do believe that the DA is very, very unequally treated in the media. I don't really have an understanding of why, but it's just one of those things. Is there an element of concern within the DA about racism, or is all of this really just a false accusation?
Well, Howard, to answer your question, I'd say everything, all of the above. In other words, I think there's an enormous amount of false, distorting noise out there, which is, you've got these disgraceful, disreputable people like Iqbal Survey, feeding a really pot of poison that emanates from independent newspapers. I mean, no one reads them anymore, but they make a lot of noise. And he's driving an absolute sort of anti-DA, basically a pro the most corrupt elements in the ANC is what he's after, promoting. And then you've got people who genuinely do not think that a party which has quite a lot of white people in prominent positions should be in the body politic in the year 2024. You should take a back seat if you're a minority. And then there obviously are, look, the DA, I don't know how many votes they got, 3.5 million or something in the last election. There are a lot of people in that voting mix, some of whom I have no doubt are, very South African first patriots, others of whom probably very dodgy, kind of, bitter and racist. When the DA, and I know you're Jewish and I'm Jewish, the DA is a broad church party. It's not sort of a narrow sect of true believers. It used to be that, but in those days when I took over the leadership, it had 320,000 votes. Now it's got 10 times that number. So it's not just the sort of magic circle of the sort of northern suburbs do-gooders. Right. So obviously there are going to be people there who, don't subscribe to the sort of values and philosophies that you would have, Howard, or that I would like to believe I have. And sometimes that comes to the fore. You saw this recently with a DA MP who was suspended last week because he uttered some, appalling words, even though they had a context. But I don't know that you can never contextualize hateful language. But, but the DA, it's not so much that you have that because you're going to have it. We're all burdened by our history, and it's what you do about it. And I have to say, the DA is pretty sensitive to those accusations, but it also realizes that a lot of it's done to simply disable the party. Now, when I was involved, in fact, I made the speech with Nelson Mandela, Thabo Mbeki, then me, one or two in between us, only the head of the fifth largest party in May 1996. On the 8th of May 1996, when we agreed to the new constitution, and what really excited me then, and even animates me today, is it was a claim of equal citizenship, that no longer would your racial identity determine your life or your political chances. And that was the burden of what I said that day. And I believe that now. So I think the DA has got to keep making that claim that whites are not less than, as some would have it, but they're not more than.
No one is less than.
And they're not more than, as clearly whites were until 1994. Yeah. Now, that sometimes for the race warrior sounds like very weak tea. But that, to me, is the only essence of a worthwhile life in society.
Yeah, I think it certainly resonates with me. What do you think gave you the courage, the thick skin, maybe, to be able to do what you've done?
Well, I suppose I went to I'm embarrassed to say this, but because it shows how old I am. I went to the 50th anniversary of my matric class at Kearsley College. I think it was probably those early morning cold